Hi, and welcome to Eliiza's Brown Bag for this month. I'm Natalie Rouse Ganderton. I'm the General Manager for Eliiza in Sydney, and I'll be walking you through really an updated perspective on ethics in AI that I've kind of been through myself recently. What we'll do is we'll run through the presentation as it is at the moment, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. So if you do have questions, pop them in as you go, and we'll come back to them at the end. So firstly, what we'll consider today is what do we actually mean by ethics in AI as we understand it today. Then the risks and impacts of AI seem to have kind of crystallized at different rates in different areas in recent years. So we'll look at how our understanding and how we apply ethics in AI have evolved recently with a spotlight in a couple of key areas. We'll also take a look at some of the challenges that an unprecedented event, global event like the COVID-19 pandemic might pose to individuals and also to those building and working with models and data sets. And then we'll go through some of the things that we can apply to our own processes to ensure that our models and applications have got ethics baked in from the start. When I first started talking about ethics and AI around 4 or 5 years ago, the primary concerns really seemed to be bias and fairness. Not exclusively, but bias in input data, which then translated to biased and unfair predictions and outputs, really formed the majority of examples that we were seeing. While this is definitely still a major ethical consideration today when building models, the scope of ethics in AI has really become clearer around a broader range of considerations like privacy and consent, the environmental impact of resource consumption, and the importance of considering the outcomes of the use of a model at the individual, subpopulation, and population level. Explainability is, of course, an ongoing key tenet of ethical AI. So then now that we're on the same page about what we mean by ethical AI, let's dive into the evolution of the conversation over the past few years, starting with the most controversial subfield of computer vision, facial recognition. So back in 2018, an undergraduate student, Joy Buolamwini, realized that while trying to get a facial recognition system to recognize her face, that where it had trouble detecting her darker-skinned face at all, it recognized her immediately when she put on a white Halloween mask. She decided to test the 3 main facial recognition tools on the market at the time, and she's since repeated that analysis on others. And she found between a 20 to 35% gap between the best and worst performing groups across all tools. Now, what she found was, of course, that because lighter skinned male subject seemed to be the predominant group that these algorithms were trained on, that of course they performed better in recognizing these faces. And darker skinned females were the worst performing group across all 3 algorithms. So this study really kicked off a global conversation. And Joy then founded the Algorithmic Justice League for her to continue the conversation and push for change. So that led to IBM initially, in the first instance, improving their performance before then finally abandoning the technology altogether last year. The government, while legislation doesn't exist at a national level for many countries across the globe, the discussion continues today, and there are a lot of talks and efforts around the world to get legislation regulating the use of facial recognition technology. And across the US, there are city-level bans in place in several cities. Now, the next really thing that people started to look at was what is actually behind these algorithms. What data sets are being used to train these algorithms, the open source public data sets, and beyond just what bias exists in those data sets, where were they even coming from? And had people given permission for their images to be used in these data sets, which were then in turn used by growing numbers of governments, militaries, and corporations across the globe? It was discovered, in fact, that people included in these data sets had no knowledge of the use of their images. And the justification of that use was that the images were uploaded under the terms of a Creative Commons license, which is the online copyright agreement, which allows images to be copied and reused by anyone for academic and commercial purposes. But Creative Commons itself has now put out a statement to clarify that this license was only ever intended to unlock copyright, and copyright's not the right tool to stand in for user consent, privacy, and ethics. Several of the most widely cited public data sets have now been removed from the internet, but that hasn't actually stopped them from continuing to be cited in papers since then. So it's very difficult to remove these data sets once they get out there in the wild. In 2019, a group of researchers actually wrote a letter to respectfully ask that an academic paper be retracted, since it contained details of training an algorithm to recognize faces of Uyghur people, who are the mainly Muslim ethnic minority group in China. It was also reported that the Chinese government, in fact, used facial recognition technology to identify and track Uyghurs, in the first known example of a government intentionally using AI for racial profiling. Moving on to 2020, there was a growing movement in the scientific community to recognize and reject not just controversial use cases, but also unethical research practices, including bias and lack of consent in training data sets. Several journalists and conferences have introduced ethics checks, including NeurIPS conference, which is one of the leading global conferences on AI, which introduced a requirement for submissions to include a statement addressing ethical concerns. There have been many more instances of academics speaking out against the publication of studies which they say provide a scientific veneer to automated methods that only exacerbate existing biases. But ultimately, the community still really seems to be divided over whether it's ethical to decouple research from its potential practical uses. And that's a hard question, because many of those uses could be incredibly beneficial to society, like finding lost children or remote monitoring of consenting participants in medical trials. This month, you may have seen a new documentary released on Netflix, which follows Joy Buolamwini and a number of others from the publication of the Gender Shade Study to testifying for Congress and advocating for federal regulation of facial recognition technology. It also introduces us to the Big Brother Watch group in the UK, who are advocating for citizens' privacy and regulation in the UK, and also highlights really the completely opposing approach in China, where all citizens are already subject to facial recognition and surveillance in many areas of their lives. It's a really well documented and constructed snapshot of the current state of the technology, and I highly recommend checking it out. So we've just looked at facial recognition today, but if you want to look at the broader conversation around computer vision, you'd see a whole other conversation around the ethics of self-driving cars that we don't have time for today. So let's move on and look at how the dialogue around the ethics of natural language processing has evolved. So back when I started researching ethical AI, There was a study out of Cornell University that uncovered gender bias in popular open source word embedding models. How these models work is they learn distances in between similar words in order to learn semantic relations. So with the example shown in the bottom right there, we can see that the distance between man and king is the same as the distance between woman and queen, with the same gender distances and the royal relationship there. Now, if we were to do the same thing for nurses and doctors, the words nurse and doctor might be, we know from our own sort of human knowledge that we would expect that the words like nurse and doctor might be similar distances from the words man and woman. However, that's not the case. Our historic gender stereotypes have crept in, and instead we see that nurse is actually closer to woman than it is to man, and doctor is closer to man. So these word embeddings were trained on really large public data sets, and it turns out that it wasn't actually the models themselves that are introducing the gender bias, but they're learning the biases already existing in our historic public data. Now, let's take a look at what's going on in this area today and how that's evolved. We can see that in there's this paper that's been published this year that actually caused a pretty big kerfuffle towards the end of last year, called "On the Danger of Stochastic Parrots: Can Language Models Be Too Big?" Now, this paper has been pretty controversial because it led to the firing of two of the authors, both Dr. Timnit Gebru and Dr. Margaret Mitchell, who's listed on the final paper as Schmargaret Mitchell. Now, this paper highlights the environmental, financial, and social harms of using these ever-increasingly large language models. Now, what the paper advocates is that rather than just ingesting everything on the web, actually limiting and curating data sets for language models up front, because the inherent misrepresentation and biases that exist on the web today, and also the double impacts of financial costs and environmental impacts, including resource consumption, all contribute to outsized impacts on marginalised communities. It also warns of the dangers then of misdirection of research effort. So they argue that although these large deep learning or transformer language models outperform any previous models on natural language understanding benchmarks, there is no true understanding happening, and therefore there's an opportunity cost to continuing to develop these models for these tasks instead of furthering research on actual meaning capturing approaches or more effective ways of building and curating these usable data sets that remove bias and cater for a broader range of languages. So speaking of Google, let's take a look at the large tech companies' relationship with the ethics of their AI in recent years. So in 2018, the honeymoon was really over for Facebook with two major scandals. They admitted that their engagement maximization model was responsible for inciting violence in Myanmar. And we also found out that they'd allowed a study which collected and then sold our personal details to Cambridge Analytica, who then built models to influence our voting preferences using Facebook's own highly specific targeted advertising. In response, they established a dedicated AI ethics team, and we'll check in on how they're doing today shortly. Around about this same time, Google was establishing their ethical AI research team. MIT Tech Review published a piece last year exposing how Facebook's responsible AI team have been mandated with focusing solely on model bias, creating a product called Fairness Flow, which is intended to help identify bias and unfairness in models. which is a great thing to do. But given that they have inconsistent use of fairness definitions, and also much larger accusations of inflaming polarization due to the engagement maximization policy, focusing solely on bias seems a little underbaked. So partly in response also to the ongoing conversation around facial recognition, and partly in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, last year Amazon paused selling their recognition service to law enforcement agencies to give the US federal government time to enact some legislation. And meanwhile, Microsoft is also actively backing legislation in some areas. But probably the biggest story in recent months in AI ethics globally would have to be the firing of Drs. Gebru and Mitchell from their senior posts in the ethical AI team at Google. This is something that's really shaken the faith in these companies' commitment to the development of ethical AI. And it really remains to be seen how governments step up to the plate with legislation over the coming months and years so that we're not relying on any company's goodwill to do the right thing. We're already familiar with many of the potential harms that could arise from algorithmic decision making, such things as illegal discrimination, unfair practices around hiring and employment, credit, prices of goods, and increased surveillance and other potential harms on a personal and societal level. But so we understand that those things were already a risk in a non-pandemic world. But then how might those risks change as people's circumstances change so unevenly during a period like we've seen over the past year due to COVID-19? Well, what sorts of extraordinary hardships might people in Australia or New Zealand have faced during the pandemic? Many people have lost their jobs or had a significant reduction in their working hours. Not everybody has had access to wage subsidies or benefits. I know myself as a New Zealand citizen living in Australia, I had access to JobKeeper when that arrived, but not Jobs Seeker at the beginning of the pandemic. So people like myself and people in people with other citizenships, people in less contract or temporary jobs, for example, may not have been eligible for any subsidies at all. People in these situations may have found themselves missing loan repayments or utility payments or rental payments, which in turn could have impacted their credit rating, or even worse, led to a loss of housing. Many people went through a divorce or separation, or experienced mental health issues as a result of the extreme stress and hardship of the pandemic. Now, imagine some of the decisions or predictions that might be made on some of these indicators, such as employment status, financial position, credit rating, housing status, marital status, or even mental state. And there are so many decisions that are being taken based on these factors in everyday life, either algorithmically or manually. Now, you might be able to appeal to a human being making a decision, explain your situation and the extenuating circumstances, but algorithms are impervious. So what's important to note here is that what this represents is likely to be a breakdown in previous relationships and patterns in datasets. Previously, we may have seen that people with credit scores below a certain threshold may have tended to be unreliable in making repayments. Or people who've missed multiple mortgage or rental payments may not make great tenants, and so on. But now we have people who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves in really difficult positions that if the algorithms deciding their fate continue to decide based on pre-COVID patterns, may make it incredibly difficult for them to climb out of. Add to that existing biases of gender, race, and so on, and we could see an extreme exacerbation of the existing harms for already marginalised groups. So what can we do about this? Now, as data professionals, we have an ethical and moral obligation to make sure that we try to mitigate as much of these negative impacts as possible and not to contribute to the hardship experienced by so many people. There are a number of steps that we can take towards this goal, although unfortunately, because this period will have such uneven and previously unseen variability, it's not going to be as an easy step-by-step process, and it's going to require careful consideration of the change in behaviour and situation at an economic level, at a population level, and at an individual level to decide what the right approach will be for data sets and for their associated use cases. First, we really need to examine all data sets for any broken patterns for any of the columns or features across this period, and also in the relationships between columns or features. So this will help us understand what may have changed and whether our dataset is still fit for purpose. Then we need to understand any changes in behaviour pre and post COVID. Has behaviour and patterns snapped back post lockdowns to during lockdowns? Have people always shopped in store perhaps, but switched to home delivery during lockdown? Have those people returned to in-store shopping with the same frequency, for instance? Or have commuting patterns changed post-lockdown as more people adopt a hybrid versus remote, in-office versus remote working model? Then there are a number of other choices that we can make based on what we see in the data and based on how that impacts the results that we need to drive. Is it fairer to exclude the pandemic period entirely? Say if we're looking at loan or rental payment default? Or might we need to give more importance to recent data? Say if we've seen a behaviour change that we want to prioritise, like changed work behaviour or income for many people who will have found new employment recently. It'll also be really important to look at what specifically any models are using to base their predictions on. For example, might the presence of welfare payments have been a factor in making a prediction? And what impact does that have when many more people have received government support over the last year? We might even choose to introduce a human in the loop to new or previously automated processes in order for them to be able to add more human fairness and compassion into the decision-making process. And this is just the start. I would highly advise you to sit and think very carefully about your specific data sets and use cases and the steps that you might take in your specific environment to make sure you're not perpetuating hardship. Having a framework for following ethics procedures might be a useful tool in doing this. So we've put together some high-level guidelines to help you out. In order to have an effective framework for baking ethics into all of your AI projects, you need to consider three components: an independent review capability and both the quantitative and qualitative considerations. The concept of an independent AI review board comes from the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, concept that exists in medicine today to mitigate the risks of medical research projects. There are some useful parallels that make sense between healthcare and AI. So there's similar kinds of risks, ethical risks, when you think about potential harm to individuals or groups, privacy issues, and risks as a result of a particular technology. As part of your AI review board, you need to think about who you're going to have as part of this board. What we need in those groups are a range of subject matter experts, people with the ability to look at legal considerations, and also people with a good understanding of what ethical risks might be posed. Diversity is really the key for these boards. We need not just a diversity of expertise, but a diversity of perspectives. The jurisdiction of this board is to consult prior to research in order to identify potential risks up front, so that the actual research procedure may take into account those potential risks from the outset. What's also really important for these review boards is independence and power of veto. Now, in the medical industry, these things are a legal matter, but you might want to include these and enforce these components, so that to improve your reliability and reputation for consistency on these issues. In terms of values, I have just repeated, I've made a little mistake in my slides there. But in terms of values, that is something that at an organizational level, you want to be empowering this board to work with your organization to understand what values you want to embed in your ethical framework and how you're going to uphold those values in all of your AI engagements. On the technology or quantitative side, there are existing bias detection tools on the market today, such as SageMaker's Clarify and Facebook's Fairness Flow. But in addition to that, we really need to do a full input data set audit and also model output audit. And by that, I mean we need to understand by feature and by subpopulation. What's the imbalance in classes that you have within features? What kinds of distributions and correlations have you got within your features and between your features? Also, what personally identifiable or demographic information have you got in the data set, and how is that managed? And then on the outputs of the model, we also want to redo an analysis by feature and by subpopulation and by classification to understand if the predictions and outputs are significantly different by classification or by subpopulation. On the qualitative side, we really need to include stakeholder engagement, also considerations around human-centered design. So that's really considering at the outset of a project, how are any predictions that we make going to impact the users or the people that this problem is designed to solve. Also, how are our predictions or outputs being consumed across all downstream users? What are the different ways that these predictions might be incorporated into other processes? And that will allow us to understand things like the privacy impact on subjects or users, and also look at any potential harms and other ethical impacts that could come into play. Now, I hope that that's been a useful overview of what kind of how to build a framework for your organization. I might pass over to Kate to see if we've had any questions.
Haven't had any questions yet, but if anyone has any, just feel free to drop them in the questions section on the panel on the right.
Really, I guess the main point is that this is really an evolving area and conversation, and something that we just need to be super aware of as we design and build and implement any artificial intelligence models and use cases. and really anything around the periphery of those, from data collection right the way through to the impact on subjects or users, and continue asking questions right throughout that life cycle, and not be afraid to raise concerns around this. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today. And feel free to get in touch with Eliiza if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share with us.